So today we're going to be looking at a common misunderstanding of René Girard's mimetic theory, in particular the scapegoating mechanism. As an example, have a look at this clip.
It's a little bit too Protestant-y for me,
But it's not just that. It's that Girard misses another aspect of sacrifice. And so if you take the Yom Kippur sacrifice, for example, it's like there are two sacrifices, my friend. There's one that is out to the wilderness, and there's one that's offered up. And the sacrifice that's offered up is not the same, Christ brings them together, and in a very, very mind-shattering way, but they're not the same. And so, it's like, when, for example, like the pouring out of libations and all of these types of behaviors that the ancients said cannot be reduced to scapegoat sacrifice. And so Girard, it's as if Girard gets half of the story right, but he's missing an entire half of the story, which makes his theory, in my opinion, insufficient. And
the link to the video will be in the description if you want to get the conversation in context. So Girard compares the biblical scapegoat of Leviticus 16 with Girard's scapegoating mechanism and observes that there was another sacrifice that was offered up, which is not the scapegoat. And based on that, he concludes that Girard only sees half the picture. In another interview with Luke Burgess, Girard reiterates this view. And rather surprisingly, Burgess sees nothing wrong with the view and supports it by saying Girard identifies a particular kind of sacrifice. Again, the link to the video I'll put in the description. So I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding. Girard's scapegoating mechanism is not a ritual. It is not a sacrifice. Rather, it's a process that lays a foundation from which these religious phenomena develop. A part of the misunderstanding has to do with the terminology of scapegoating and the concepts they represent from both a theological perspective and from a Girardian anthropological perspective. So we're going to begin with the semantic history of the word scapegoat. The Oxford English Dictionary tells us that the word scapegoat was coined by William Tyndale with his 1530 translation of the Bible. It names one of two goats that was chosen by Lot to be sent alive into the wilderness, the sins of the people having been symbolically laid upon it. And it simply referred to the goat that escaped, hence the scapegoat. So the earliest use of the word describes a Levitical ritual. There's no punitive meaning to it. And David Dawson wrote a great little book called Flesh Becomes Word, in which he kind of explores the semantic history of the word. And I want to read to you what he says in his book. So the scapegoating word, it begins life as a ritual animal. It spends 16 centuries as a Christian typology, and ultimately wanders into the vernacular as an expression whose popularity and breadth of application quickly surpass that of its primary meaning. Then there is the question of its earliest metaphorical uses. One dictionary notes that the history of the biblical scapegoat in English literature following Tyndale's translation is virtually a blank page, and that the word has almost entirely lost the force of biblical association by the Victorian period, and so tends merely to indicate a person, a group, a thing that bears the blame for others. And so Dawson's aim in that book is to examine how does the goat that got away become a signifier of vicarious punishment. So the history of the development of the scapegoat idea within Christian topology is complex and fascinating. Even before we bring Girard's ideas into the conversation, the scapegoat embodies a complex history. But that is beyond the scope of what I want to do here. If you're interested in that history, get Dawson's book. It's obvious that Peugeot and others begin from this theological, biblical perspective of the scapegoat, and then they try and work out whether Girard has anything useful to add with his scapegoating mechanism, assuming that his idea maps onto the Levitical scapegoat because it shares a term in common. That's a misunderstanding. So let's now consider the Girardian scapegoating mechanism in its own right. Girard did not begin from this biblical perspective of the Levitical scapegoat. His idea has its birth in the events prior to ritual, prior to sacrifice, in fact, prior to humans. Girard is not even imagining how religious humans invented a particular kind of sacrifice, as Luke Burgess suggests. No, Girard is exploring the process that made us human. And he's careful to note that this process does not refer to any particular event or one kind of sacrifice. Rather, it identifies a general pattern that lays the foundation for all kinds of sacrifice. In addition, Girard is adamant that the process is unconscious. So, let me reiterate to try and make this as clear as possible. Girard identifies an unconscious, spontaneous process, a general pattern of events that were instrumental in the evolution of hominids becoming human. I hope it's clear by now that when we consider the concept within its narrative sequence, we are nowhere near the Yom Kippur scapegoat of Leviticus. In fact, we are nowhere near the biblical text. We are before a writing was invented. So understanding the sequence of where the idea develops is a key. So what I want to do now is to give a short, not a comprehensive, just a short description of these events. If you can imagine such a primitive community where there are no prohibitions against violence, an outbreak of violence would easily escalate. Now, mimetic theory and specifically mimetic desire and the twisting of desire gives great insight into why conflict is likely and why it emerges. But again, we're not considering that aspect of it. Simply this aspect, that in primitive communities where there are no prohibitions or laws against violence, an outbreak of violence is likely to escalate. You kill one of our family, we'll kill 3 of yours. It's the nature of violence. Uncontrolled violence often resulted in the near annihilation of a whole community. And such violence became an obstacle for smaller communities to develop into larger civilizations. That was the major issue. How do we control violence? As Girard imagines it, a primitive community at some point finds itself in this familiar scenario where tension escalates, where frustration grows, where violence breaks out and it carries a momentum. Violence escalates. and the community who have often been in this situation wonders, will this be another frenzy of violence where everyone turns against everyone, where it's a war of all against all? So the group is swept along by this unseen yet irresistible current. It's an unconscious mechanism. However, at one stage within human history, it seems like a new solution emerged to provide an alternative to this uncontrolled violence. And so something unforeseen happens in this scenario, where at the moment where the group is about to descend into uncontrolled, violent, cathartic release, one of the community members points to another. And so the source of frustration is suggested by this gesture. It's significant that this pointing, this accusation, is the biblical term satanos, the accuser, the accusation. So violence finds a focus. A crowd converges upon a single victim and one dies instead of many. And this is a very significant moment within human history, because if violence can be reduced or controlled, it means that smaller communities can develop into larger civilizations, or it's an essential building block for that to happen. So Girard speculates how when the blind passion subsides and the violence ceases, the chaotic noise makes way for a moment of silent attention. In this flicker of contemplation, everyone glimpses a symbol that overflows with meaning, the corpse of the victim. One that was in the community is now out, and his death means life for the remaining community. Chaos has been transformed into order by this dead body. Now, why is that so significant? In Girard's thought, the mimetic cycles and the scapegoating mechanisms are not processes that humans invented, but rather the very processes that made us human. So these evolutionary events transformed animals into humans by providing the possibility for complex symbolic thought and language. So the corpse of the scapegoat serves precisely as the kind of symbol that contains such a density and excess of meaning that it can serve as the catalyst for the emergence of the uniquely human complex symbolic thought. Now, if we just think scapegoating mechanism means sacrifice, we will miss the depth of what is happening here. Because if these are events that shaped human consciousness, and some very fundamental misinterpretations happened there, but it will enrich our understanding of what Jesus did when he brought us back to that very founding event that shaped our consciousness. So to just think scapegoating mechanism is a kind of sacrifice, we will completely miss this insight of Girard. The very possibility of meaning making relies on the recognition of differences. Girard shows how the chaos that precedes the act of scapegoating violence represents a crisis of undifferentiation. At this stage of the crisis, rationality does not guide the frenzied mob. An irrational act of violence brings a cathartic end to the chaos. And so here we have a very significant moment of possibility, a moment in which the irrational passions are satisfied, thereby creating room to consider the meaning of the moment. So mindless rage gives way to focused wonder. In no other event might opposites become as intense and obvious as in the corpse of the scapegoat, of this chosen victim. It symbolizes the death that brought life, the chaos that brought order, the violence that brought peace, the outcast and the community, the curse and the blessing, the demonic and the divine. Can you see how all these contrasts and extreme contrast finds a symbol within this corpse? And so I would suggest that maybe this was the first moment in which we vaguely heard the appeal of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world, Revelations 13:8, to our conscience, or more precisely, the innocence of our victim created an opportunity for conscience, a sense of right and wrong to emerge. Within the series of events in which an individual or a minority are murdered or expelled from a community, the chosen victims are incorrectly blamed for the chaos. And it is because of this aspect of the process that Girard chose the word scapegoating in its modern usage of to blame or persecute. And he adds the term mechanism to it to emphasize this unconscious nature of this series of events. So let's now consider how this process relates to ritual and myth. First of all, the process is not a ritual. It's prior to. So in its earliest iteration of this process, it cannot be called ritual. Girard gives this early iteration a different name. He calls it the founding murder. Ritual and myth will develop from it, but the scapegoating mechanism is prior to ritual, prior to sacrifice, and serves as the foundation on which the great diversity of rituals and myths will be constructed. Why? Because the community will again face a crisis, and they will remember how the previous crisis was averted. For the effect and the meaning of the scapegoating mechanism to continue, the community needs to remember the event. And the best way of remembering in a pre-literate age will be through reenactment. And so consequently, ritual develops. Later on, we'll consider our rituals from a more rational point of view, and we'll start developing myths and stories and explanations around them. But at this early stage, we don't know why it works. All we know is that it works. But uncontrolled violence can be tamed through introducing a ritualistic, controlled form of violence. So if there is a valid criticism of Girard, it might be in his theory being too broad and universal. We might look at that in another video. But to say that he identifies a particular kind of sacrifice with his concept of scapegoating mechanism or is simply a misunderstanding. To think that it only applies to the scapegoat of Leviticus and not to other kinds of sacrifices again it means that you don't understand what Girard is saying about the foundational events prior to ritual and sacrifice. So Girard's ideas certainly have value for how we understand biblical ritual and sacrifice. But this value will be obscured if we try to artificially squeeze these ideas into pre-existing theological concepts. I think we first need to understand Girard in his own right. So let me try and summarize the misunderstanding. There are a few reasons for this common misunderstanding of Girard's scapegoating mechanism. First, don't assume that the term scapegoating has the same meaning across different domains. In fact, just don't get hung up on terminology at all. At least try and understand the underlying concepts around those words. Secondly, and this is very significant, is understand the development of these concepts in their narrative sequence. A series of events that contributed to the evolution of hominids a few 100,000 years ago do not directly map onto the Yom Kippur rituals. Some careful interpretation is necessary. Third, confusing the general for the particular is another common mistake. So why do I think this is important to address? We all misunderstand things on a regular basis. That's just part of the joy of being human. But sometimes we go on and we misrepresent the ideas of others based on our own misunderstandings. And that's a problem because it devalues ideas and kind of robs us from the beauty that we could enjoy in them. So Girard's idea, if we engage with it deeply, has got a great depth of value. It can give us insight into the processes that made us human and why they are so deeply embedded within our own psyche. And that's why I think it's worth bringing clarity to some of these misunderstandings and areas. There's a lot more areas that I think Girard's often misunderstood in. Today was more engaging with some popular misunderstandings. I might delve into some more academic criticisms of him in the future. But thanks for listening. Bye.